More than 100 years ago, the Otway Ranges were home to 12 large timber mills and many smaller mills dotted around the hills. Some of these timber towns had populations of over 100. At the industry's peak, the Otways were serviced by a flourishing railway, a network of timber tram lines, schools, butcher shops and other suppliers.
The timber industry in the Otways, you could say, started in about 1850, around about Apollo Bay. Settlers moved in there and it was a timber camp there. The timber there that were growing around Apollo Bay were mainly blue gum, and that was used as split timber and taken away by ship, of course, because there were no roads into that area. So the split timber was taken away by ship and to the various markets. A lot of the timber from down there was used for railway sleepers. On the Bendigo Railway, timber went from there. And in some instances, I believe that logs were actually hauled to the beach and floated out into the ocean and picked up on the ships and taken away that way.
By 1879, all unclaimed land in the Otways was available for settler selection.
In hindsight, that was one of the greatest disasters, I think, that ever happened in the Otways. Many people wanting to get on the land bought the land sight unseen from land offices in Geelong, Melbourne, Ballarat, Warrnambool and so on, and they moved to the Otways. They'd come down to Colac or whatever it was by train, and then they'd have to go and find the piece of land that they'd selected. And when they eventually paddled through the mud and eventually got there and identified where it was, and some of them didn't even identify where it was, they actually set to clearing someone else's bit. When they got there, they were confronted with a forest of trees, some of them over 200 feet high, and they came there to farm, not to look at trees. Anyway, the majority of them set to with a will unbelievable, and they ring-barked, they felled the trees and they burnt them, and they cleared away the scrub and destroyed huge amounts of forest on these little land settlements. And then the problem started. They realised that they couldn't get produce in, they couldn't get produce out. The roads were atrocious, many of them were just pack tracks.
My grandfather Curtis selected land at Kangalang. He and his wife never lived there on the property. They always remained in Geelong. There were several boys and 4 girls in the family. They cleared it hoping to become farmers, I think, but it was apparently not viable because after a few years of farming or attempting to farm, they gave up the ghost, as you say, and the land went back into bush. It was quite a big acreage, and Hayden's sawmill, they milled the timber which was on that property at Kangalang.
In 1899, a Royal Commission found that the manner in which the Otways were being settled was unacceptable, and it recommended that the remaining timbered areas be retained for water supply and milling. A reserve of 64,000 hectares was then set aside permanently as state forest. By the 1890s, sawmillers had moved into the Otways. Initially, bullock teams were used to move the cut timber to Colac. But with the advent of rail links, a successful timber industry developed around the town of Forest.
Once the railway was put in, then it was possible to move the timber quite easily rather than slowly by bullock team and dray. The railway then was able to cart the timber and also farm produce as well.
In the early days, the mills were deep in the bush, and while some families lived nearby, many of the timber workers were single men who lived in timber huts with just a fireplace and a few bunks.
mills would soon appear out in the ranges wild, as tough men fell the timber and milled them there in time. Just like little townships, the sawmills then appeared. Tram lines from the bay reached up into the mill. The railway trucks would rumble along on wooden rails as horses drew them on to Lawn and Apollo Bay. No roads would link these sawmills, just rail lines to the sea, as the timber getters worked on and felled the mighty tree.
Henry's mill, it had operated in the Noonday Creek, and then they had a large timber lease then above that, which was above Sanderson and Grant's operation. There was a bit of dissension between the two firms, and Sanderson and Grant wouldn't allow Henry's to use their same line, so Henry's actually engaged Irish miners from the Ballarat and Daylesford area to actually put a tunnel through the hill so that they could get through to their timber resource above. And that tunnel went through to Henry's No. 1 Mill settlement, which was a township bigger than Forest is today. I think they would have had probably about 100 people lived there. You know, they had their wives and their families, and of course they had the bloke that was doing the baking, and then they had the steam engine drivers, the winch drivers, they had the blacksmith to look after the horses. They had the school teacher there because they ran their own school. They had their own post office and their own franking stamp too for the post office. In the first instance, the timber was felled with axes and cross-cut saws, and it was split. All the timber in the houses were actually split, and they'd always picked the very best trees to split them from. That was the scantling, which was the 4x2s, the uprights and so on, and they were split, and the palings were used to do the outside walls, and in many cases the palings were used on the roof as well, or shingles or shakes as they called them, which were shorter, and they were used for the roof. So the whole house was built, and many houses were built from one tree. In fact, the hotel at Beech Forest, I think the whole hotel was built from one tree. Also, in some of the smaller timber, mainly around the foothills, they used pit saws where there was a man on the bottom and a man up on the top. The log was rolled over a pit, and the guy down in the bottom was on the bottom end of the saw, and the top notcher, he was on the top. He was the top notcher. He didn't get the sawdust down his neck, and so we get the bit of a saying, the top notcher. He was a top notcher. In the 1950s they started to bring in the chainsaws, and I think by the mid-1960s all the crosscuts were just about gone.
In 1908, the Forest Act established reserved forest areas, the control of forest production and the collection of royalties. The Forest Commission was created in 1918, and it was this commission which bought back many of the failed farms in the Otways and replanted them with native trees, creating the forests we have today.
A lot of the farms, for winter feed, they just actually go out to their boundary and drop a match and let it burn away in the forest, and then through the spring the nice young wiregrass shoots would come up, and that's where the cattle would actually live in the winter time. And they'd eat the wiregrass, and then the next year they'd burn it again. And so the forest around many of these farms become very, very derelict. So we could look at the Ricketts or Curtis's or Smith's or Penman's property along the top of the ridge, and these were typical properties that had been vacated early on into the sort of 1920s. I think they were sort of gone from those properties, and these properties went back into weeds and blackberries and scrub, and in some little pockets were timber. So that timber was salvaged off there, and then the Forest Commission would then actually replant that back and get that back into a healthy state. And this went on right through the end of the 1950s, and it escalated right through the 1960s and even went on into the 1970s. And gradually these old farmlands were then regenerated back into healthy forests. logging was taking place, and back in those days it was mainly selective logging, which didn't work terribly good in mountain ash areas. In the late 50s and early 60s, there was a change in the way that the forests were actually logged. So that's when the clear felling came in. And one of the reasons they looked at the clear felling, I suppose, was to get proper regeneration, because you couldn't get regeneration if you had a forest crop there already, even though it wasn't a healthy crop. It was the remains of what was good forest once that had got into a very derelict state. And so this clear felling came in, which was actually a bit more like the way nature does it. As a bushfire goes through and it actually wipes it out and you get a complete regeneration.
Under a scorching sun and whipped by rising winds, the many small fires which were burning separately seemed to join together in a sudden avalanche of flame.
Bushfires, which are a natural and regular occurrence in Victoria, have had a major impact on the Otways and its inhabitants. After the 1939 fires, the Sthradher inquiry recommended that the timber workers and their families should no longer be housed at the mill sites, but rather in small towns nearby.
I do remember we lived near Mount Sabine on a little farm, and I can remember my mother being very concerned for quite some days with the smoke that was coming in. I remember it was very, very thick smoke, and on this particular day I went with my mother over to the dairy and she actually unbolted the separator, which was probably one of the most expensive bits of stuff that we had on the property, and she actually unbolted it and carried it out and put it in the middle of the potato paddock so that it wouldn't get burnt. But we weren't actually hit by the fires, but the 39 fires, like the 1919 fires and the 1890 fires and the 1850 fires, they went through much of the Otways. From that bushfire, the Judge Sthradher inquiry, or the Royal Commission if you like, by Judge Sthradher, recommended that all sawmills should be moved out of the forest and moved to the townships for the safety of the people, because there were so many people burnt in those 1939 bushfires that devastated much of Victoria. The reason that the mountain ash forests have actually survived is because of fire. Of course, it had to be pretty extreme weather conditions for the fires to actually go up into those mountain areas. But once they did sweep through a mountain ash area, mountain ash can't survive fire the same as alpine ash can't, so it would be killed. But nature worked its miracle, and the seed would drop from the tops of the trees and it would come up as thick as it could possibly stick. Now, if they were quick enough to be able to get in there and actually take that off before it started to rot, then they could actually still use the timber for some years. And I think after the 1939 fires in the Dandenongs, friends of mine from Apollo Bay worked up there for some years afterwards, actually cutting the fire-killed ash, and it was quite good timber. One typical area that we look at from the Barramunga lookout, and we can look back over the West Barwon catchment. Looking up the valley, that's where Henry's had their sawmill settlement with their post office and the shops and everything else that they had. And the tram lines ran all through there with Sanderson Grants and Henry's operations. And we look at it now and it's regenerated back into such a pristine state. But it's changed, and it's changed all the way through, yet it's still there, the timber.
William rode and I cut a track down through the ranges wild. Near Nagura to Cape Otway, this track was 6 feet wide. Down came the heavy wagons to take away the stone, to build Cape Otway Lighthouse all those years ago. Sawmills then appeared on the northern side, and timber there was carried on wooden railway lines. From Dean's Marsh, Bowen Downs and Forest Town in time, timber for the townships, railway lines and the mines. They hauled the trucks by horses and steam trains later on. The little engines panted as they moved along. One engine had a funnel that folded down, it said, to fit through a small tunnel cut through the hillside there. On wooden rails it crept through to service Henry's mill and bring out sawn timber. The stories told is still. Far way back in history, the timber getters came to fall the giant timber out on the Otway ranges. And those days have gone and fade to history. The old timbermen still tell the tales and dreams.